Good morning, everybody. Delighted so many of you could join us today for this morning's economic update with Professor Joe Nellis. Many of you will know Joe from our previous economic updates, but for those that don't, Joe is a Professor of Global Economics at Cranfield University, so we're really pleased to have him here once again to give us his thoughts on both the UK and global economy. The format of today is that Joe will be presenting for about 45 minutes or so. There will be an opportunity for Q&A afterwards, so do please submit your questions using the submit question icon. We also have three tax experts from MHA MacIntyre Hudson, Nigel May, Chris Days and Alison Horner. They too will also be on hand to answer any tax-related questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Professor Joe Nellis.
Thank you, Atul. It's great to be here this morning and welcome everybody to this economic update. I hope you can all see my slides. I've got a lot that I want to share with you, although I suppose there are no big surprises. We've got a problem. But what I want to try and do is put it into some context. Without further ado, let me just make the first apology. As an economist, I have to admit that prediction today is extremely difficult, especially about the future. And if anybody out there knows what's going to happen, then, well, congratulations. There is so much uncertainty that it's causing a tremendous stoppage in consumer and business confidence, which is the critical factor right now. In terms of some of the questions that I wanted to think about more deeply, and I'll touch on some of these, of course, as we go through this presentation. We are in a global recession. The only question is, how long will it last and how deep will it be? A number of people are asking, will it be a depression? It won't be a depression. A depression is a fall in GDP for at least 2 years. I do not expect that, certainly not in the UK or in most countries of the world. So let's take that one off the agenda immediately. I guess globally, the big challenge is, which regions of the world will be least negatively affected and which will be most negatively affected, and where will the UK sit in this choice. I am concerned about the prospects for international trade, and I want to stress this point later, but just briefly, I want us to think about how the balance of power globally is changing, what I call the spheres of influence. The USA and its alliance, the EU, question mark, and its allies around that, and of course China, Russia, and other countries that tend towards that sphere of influence. I want to come back to that later. This crisis has got implications for the economy, short term and potentially longer term. In that respect, I'm most concerned about the scale of the debt that we're passing on to future generations. And hopefully there will be lessons for policy. We just had the global financial crisis 10 years ago, and we were just beginning to recover from that. We have not recovered from it fully. This crisis will have far-reaching implications for policy for many, many years to come. And I'm sure you've got many other questions you'd like to ask, and we'll try and deal with those later. I've put a slide up here deliberately to, in a sense, shock you. If we go back only to January this year, just 6 months ago, these were the forecasts that the IMF had put out concerning the global economy, the advanced economies, and the emerging markets and developing economies for the rest of this year and into next year. And what is amazing is just 6 months ago, we were looking at global growth potentially of 3.3%, rising slightly next year, advanced economies growing very slowly, and the emerging markets leading the way. Goodness me, what a change took place in a matter of months. Before the pandemic, this was the picture. Now it has changed fundamentally. And what we've had are really shocks on both sides of the balance sheet in terms of the supply side and in terms of the supply side and demand side shocks. Supply side shocks represents business, the production of goods and services. We've had disruptions in supply chains right across the spectrum. A tremendous reduction in the available labor supply, both because of quarantine and social distancing, as well as, of course, lockdowns. And the consequence is not surprising. There's been a dramatic fall in business confidence, which has implications, of course, for the demand side of the economy. We've had tremendous fall in consumer confidence. And I just heard on the radio the other day, the biggest fear now is about fear of the COVID-19 itself, not actually the virus, but the fear of the virus is causing a tremendous fall in consumer confidence. So we have uncertainty regarding the disease and, of course, about the success of our economic policies. Are they going to work? Are they going to pull us out of this situation? Many workers, of course, have lost income. The furlough did not pay for everybody, and it didn't pay 100%. And of course, not surprisingly, many of us are spending less, either because we're not going out to eat or to travel, but we're also increasing our savings for precautionary purposes. And then, of course, the fall in investment spending, which is for me one of the biggest concerns. Investment is the engine of growth. Investment in technology, in factories and machines, and in people. And that's one of my biggest fears for the future of this country. In terms of the global policy responses, again, no surprise here. We know what has happened. It's been on the news every single night. We've had government responses that are unprecedented around the world in order to avoid a depression. A recession cannot be avoided, but a depression can be avoided. If we just take the Eurozone and the US alone, they've committed to spending $7.4 trillion already, and I believe there is much more to come. I don't believe governments can simply turn off the tap. That could be a disaster. Alongside that, as we've seen, interest rates have now fallen to the lowest in our history. So in the UK, the base rate is now 0.1%. I never expected to see that. And they could go negative. Some countries have gone negative, along with, of course, quantitative easing, which literally means pumping money into the economy to drive down the long-term interest rates to make sure that long-term borrowing is cheap as well. And of course, many governments, including our own, have been paying workers' wages, the so-called furlough, providing inexpensive loans, and of course, bailouts for some sectors. We've seen that in France and in Germany in particular regarding the airlines. And we'll be doing the same, I suspect, very soon. Now, unless you've lived on Mars for the last 4 months, you'll have definitely heard about the alphabet economics, trying to predict the shape of economic recovery. And the V-shaped recovery is the one that, it is going to happen. There has been a sharp fall, and there will be a quick recovery. The only question is, how sharp will this right-hand part of the V be? Or will it be rather flat? I suspect it will not be as sharp in terms of recovery as we would like. I think we're going to spend several quarters struggling. We will get growth. Let's be clear. There will be growth in this year, towards the end of this year. But for the year as a whole, we will still have a recession. A number of people are predicting a U-shaped recovery. Some call it the bath recovery. In other words, we're going to languish for several quarters. I think we're going to be between the V and the U. We should not be over-optimistic. I wish I was wrong, but I believe we are going to have some problems for quite some time. I really do fear the W recovery, the so-called double dip. And this will happen if we have a second surge of the virus and a second lockdown. In other words, the time when we're recovering, we may be knocked back again by enforced closures. And of course, the one we don't want to talk about is the L. I often say L is hell. This is the economy falling and remaining at a low level of activity for a long time, and that would become a new normal, somewhat like the Great Depression in the 1930s. But I'm not expecting it, just noting that this is a possibility but not a likelihood. Now, the very latest figures that came out about 2 weeks ago from the World Bank map out at least the World Bank's view of where the world is going. I've taken this back to the financial crises. The world was still growing in 2010. We did get through the crisis quite quickly, and the world economy has grown steadily since then. But you'll notice, of course, in 2020, the World Bank, not surprisingly, is predicting this very sharp fall. The sharpest fall, by the way, since the 1930s. Let's not forget that. The advanced economies, the red line, are going to fall further than the emerging markets and developing economies. I think that's an important point to note, because what it tells me is that the emerging markets, as they recover, are going to grow faster, and therefore their relative position in the world will strengthen. I want to come back to that point, particularly in relation to China. Very briefly on this slide, I just thought let's look back at the last 250 years. And it's not good news. This crisis has meant that we've got more economies in recession than at any time in the last 250 years. The world is in recession, very few exceptions, almost 100%, even worse than it was in 1931, which was the last time we had this scale of a crisis. And another interesting slide is this one, that if you look at the GDP per capita, the income per head, the good news is while more economies are in recession today than in the 1930s, the fall in average incomes is not as great yet as in the 1930s. The 1930s represented 18-19% fall in the average income per person. And of course, then the last year of the war and the first year of recovery, with another huge drop in GDP per capita, 1945-46. But since then, this crisis has led to the biggest drop, the biggest forecast drop in GDP per capita since the Second World War, much bigger than the global financial crisis. I wish these figures were wrong, but we're halfway through the year and the chances of them being wrong are now very, very slim. This idea of a V-shaped recovery has gained a lot of attention. Let me not exaggerate this. It is inevitable that there will be a V-shaped recovery. But my point was the right-hand side of the V may not be as sharp and incline as we would like. And this forecast from NatWest indicates this. I just want you to highlight something. Look at the US, the Euro area, the UK and Japan. That's the four that merge together. First point to note is, according to NatWest Markets, and I think they're being optimistic, we will not get back to where we were at the end of 2019 until the end of 2021. I think that's optimistic. I think it will take longer than that. I'll talk about that later. But for me, perhaps the most interesting part of this graph, of this forecast, is what we think is going to happen to China. China went into recession early, so you'll see the sharp fall in the green line, but it has begun to come out of recession sooner. And more importantly, and there will be a W-shaped occurrence. They're going to have I think another problem later, but small problem. But look at where China ends up on this forecast at the end of 2021. And I want to just highlight this for a moment. What this suggests is that China is going to come out of this crisis stronger than the rest of the world. Now, I think that has implications for the balance of power and trade relationships. It's what I call the spheres of influence. And let me highlight that once more. One sphere of influence is obviously the USA and the countries that are aligned with the USA. But the USA at the moment is looking very inward and protectionist. So its sphere of influence is more concentrated on the USA and its allies. The EU is a sphere of influence, but the EU is in economic difficulty. And of course, the UK has left the EU. We're in transition period now. And that has weakened, in my opinion, the sphere of influence of the EU and will weaken it for many years to come. And then we move to China. And China, along with Russia and a number of other countries. Now, let me be absolutely direct here. If I were the Chinese government, given the amount of money that the Chinese government has in their coffers, that they hold more dollars than any other country in the world outside the USA. They have huge financial reserves. So if I were the Chinese government, I would be going out on a mission to help countries recover from this COVID-19 crisis. I would actively seek to expand my sphere of influence, economically and politically. I'm not making a political statement. I'm simply giving you my view of what will happen. And I think we're seeing evidence of this regarding China vis-a-vis Hong Kong. Of course, the UK's position is now clear. China vis-a-vis Australia had some difficulties. China vis-a-vis USA. I think China, understandably and not surprisingly, I think will be growing its sphere of influence in the years to come. And of course, we hear this morning about the government may pull Huawei out of our G5 developments. So I think this is going to be a topic that's worth monitoring for some time. It does leave me wondering, where is the UK's position in these spheres of influence as we leave the EU? I will come back to that at the end of this presentation. In terms of sectors that have been most impacted by the crisis, again, no great surprise. I think we're all well aware of this. Tourism and hospitality has been severely hit by the crisis. And of course, while we're trying to open up these sectors, there's always the danger of another lockdown. And of course, it's more severe in some countries and some regions of some countries as you look around the world. Aviation and airlines, very badly hit. Long-haul travel is almost stopped, but not quite. And the pace of recovery, of course, is faster for domestic travel. But this is going to be a difficult recovery for the sector right across the globe. Oil and gas also been hard hit with a dramatic fall in oil prices. Not surprising because demand has been lower and yet they've been supplying oil. So there's an excess supply, which has driven down the price. And the rebound of the sector is totally dependent on consumer demand and consumer confidence. If this sector does not recover soon, it will have long-term implications. And some people may say that's a good thing. It may force us to move faster into non-oil or non-fossil fuel energy sources, which is totally understandable. And automotive industry, the car industry has been hard hit as well, although it has opened up recently, certainly in this country. But nevertheless, the supply chains that they rely on make their recovery, I think, rather challenging. Again, this country will have issues regarding Europe in terms of the supply of spare parts in the future. I just hope we can make this transition a smooth one. The consumer products only had a moderate decline. The fact is that, you know, we were still consuming things, not obviously everything, but clearly food and drink became very popular, and we've all put a bit of weight on, I suppose. But demand has been quite resilient. And of course, online growth has been dramatic. So if you take the consumer sector in total, it's only been a very small decline as we shopped in different ways. And of course, finally, in terms of sectors, consumer electronics and semiconductors have been hit. You may remember a Jaguar, suitcase fulls of key fobs coming from China. When ships stopped transporting the goods across the seas, it had a tremendous impact on this sector. But it's coming out of it quite quickly, actually. In terms of the developing countries, and you may have heard this on the radio this morning, this very point, many developing regions of the world are particularly hard hit, South Africa being an example of this. And other parts include parts of South Asia and Latin America, and especially Brazil, of course. And it's not surprising that they are at the forefront of the crisis because they've got lower health sector capacity, intensive care units and ventilators, and even access to water for washing is a problem for many people in the world. And of course, they're much more vulnerable to the global trade cycle. And so protectionism between China, Europe, USA, this is not good for the developing world. They are so dependent on us. And obviously, they've got far less access to the internet. So working from home, while I've enjoyed it to a large extent, for many people in the world, this is a challenge, and it's not easy, of course. And so in conclusion, for the global economic outlook, we're going to see the world economy shrink this year by something like 4%. That's almost guaranteed now. A much more severe contraction than we had just 10 years ago, but the rebound will be sharper. The financial crisis has taken longer. This particular crisis today, the COVID-19 crisis, is one of confidence. So provided we can find a vaccine as soon as possible, and if it's effective, then the confidence will rebound very quickly. So it is a faster recovery. And I just hope that the vaccine trials going on are going to be successful and that we can slow down this pandemic. There's a word that's popped up in the dictionary in the last few months, which I'd never heard before, and it's now called scarring. Will there be a scarring effect? Very important concept, and one worth just pausing to reflect on for a moment. Scarring effect is essentially, it's permanent damage to the economy. Let me put it that way. We're going to see, we are seeing, and we will see much higher unemployment. The danger is higher unemployment will lead to further unemployment. And the danger, therefore, is long-term unemployment, permanently higher jobless rate. Now, many economists are predicting this will not happen. Some are saying it will happen. I'm concerned for the following reason. I believe that this COVID-19 crisis has accelerated the uptake of technology in many sectors. For example, retailing. I think the high street was already in decline in many parts of the world, and including the UK. I think the COVID-19 crisis has accelerated that decline, but it has also accelerated the uptake of digital and online business for many retailers. Now, the question is this: the people who are set to lose their jobs in retailing, will they be able to switch to another occupation? Will there be another job that will match their skills? I'm not certain about that. I think there will be a permanently higher jobless rate, sadly. And it's not just retailing. I think in many, many sectors, it's going to be a similar story. At the same time, because of the lack of investment I mentioned earlier, I said earlier, investment is the engine of growth. But the fall in investment and the slow growth in investment over the last 10 years in this country has meant that productivity has grown more slowly than we would have expected. If you look at UK productivity over the last, before the financial crisis, the 40 years before the financial crisis, productivity in this country improved by about 2.4% per year. Since the financial crisis 10 years ago, we are now approximately 20% below the productivity we would have expected. So we're way below where we should be. And of course, this COVID-19 crisis is going to knock that back further. So my plea to all businesses and to the government is to focus on productivity. Productivity produces the output per person, and output per person is what pays our wages. Of course, with the danger of permanently higher unemployment, then the fear is that there will be a dependency on welfare. And that's not good for the long-term prospects for this country. Of course, this is not going to happen everywhere. There are different sectors and different age groups will be affected differently. And I just think we have to realize that we have to help other people who may not have the same opportunities as the rest of us. We are in the first steps of economic recovery. Fingers crossed, by the way. Infection rates are coming down, as we know, and that will at some point create confidence, although confidence at the moment is still very fragile in most parts of the world. The tracing, the testing, the isolation are happening. And of course, we have started the rolling back of social distancing. So we're now in this country 1 meter plus in certain situations. But again, I've said already, and everybody I'm sure agrees, recovery does depend on vaccination and treatment. Excuse me. And the big question is, when will business be back to normal? And what will normal look like? Is there a new normal? Just want to spend a few moments on this, some food for thought. Remote working, just look at today. Here we are, remote presentation. In many sectors, maybe I should say for some sectors and for some workers, may become accepted as a new normal. I personally am enjoying it, and many people will not be enjoying it. But the opportunities that are opening up cannot be ignored and won't be ignored, I think, by a number of businesses, because remote working provides more flexibility for workers. So I can work from home, you can work from home, I can shop from home. Clearly, there is a benefit in terms of lower congestion in the cities, including pollution. It's been wonderful to see that, and many people acknowledge that. And of course, it does mean lower costs for business. So I've got concerns, obviously, about the value of office blocks. Will many organizations need to keep those office blocks? And therefore, what will happen to them afterwards? And the impact on health. I hope you've all been out walking every day and getting fitter and healthier. Maybe not if you've been eating and drinking more, of course. But less pollution alone, that alone helps health. And of course, the opportunities for digital business, digital education, digital learning, what we're doing this morning, interacting across the country. So this, for some people and for some organizations, will become the new normal, or at least it'll be a blend of online and face-to-face business. But of course, we have to appreciate this does not mean it's going to be an opportunity for everybody. Clearly, it's much easier for more highly skilled workers to go online. Not everybody has the same opportunities in this respect. Different sectors. If you're working on a building site, it's very hard to build a house online. It's much easier for me, obviously. If you work in restaurants, it's very difficult to serve food online. And therefore, different occupational groups will be affected. And of course, different income groups. And I think that is a grave cause for concern, because what it suggests is that the income gap between the rich and the poor in this country and in most other countries is likely to widen as a result of these opportunities that are different for different groups across economies. That is a cause for concern, in my opinion, and one that the government surely will have to address sooner rather than later. So let's go to the UK specifically in terms of some forecasts. And as I said, the big question is a V-shaped recovery likely? Well, the answer is there will be a V-shaped recovery. Let's not stall on this one. It is going to happen, but perhaps not as nice a V as we would like. The Bank of England is now on record as saying that this is the deepest recession since records began. Actually, it's since 1706, to put it precisely. The Spanish War of Succession and many other problems at that time. So this is serious. This is something that will live with us for a very long time. In the first quarter of this year, January, February, March, the official figures indicated that GDP fell by 2%. Now, the second quarter has finished, but the official figures won't come out for another 3 or 4 weeks. There's always a time lag in compiling the figures. There's a lot of guesses out there at the moment, but I think we're going to see at least a fall of 15%. Just a few weeks ago, there was a forecast of 25% fall in one quarter, and that was a shrinkage in a 3-month period, which of course is historic, to say the least. Unemployment is rising and will continue to rise as the furlough is removed. We're then faced with the prospect of unemployment perhaps rising to 8%. I think it could be more personally. I think it'll go towards 10%. But I'm an optimist usually, although I'm losing my optimism quite quickly in this crisis. And the Chancellor announced, of course, last week some measures, which we'll come back to in a few seconds. So if you take the economy, the year as a whole, the economy has gone down in the first half and will come back up to some extent in the second half. But nevertheless, the current forecast, the best guess, I should say, is that the economy is likely to shrink in total by 8% in 2020. Again, that is the biggest drop that we've had on record, if it happens. And I don't see that being avoided, by the way. Now, of course, the Chancellor is trying his very best to help the economy recover. And he announced just last week, on 8th of July, a 30 billion spending plan to boost consumer spending and protect jobs. I have to say, I'm not as confident as he sounds in this respect, particularly in terms of unemployment. The £1,000 bonus for retaining those workers who were on furlough sounds attractive. I'm not sure it'll be that effective. Companies that are running out of cash, companies that are in trouble, are not likely to be tempted by £1,000 because the cost of wages will be far more than the £1,000 over the next 6 months. So I'm afraid on this point, I'm not that optimistic. In addition, of course, the £1,000 in theory applies to 9 million workers. So that's £9 billion. Now, I'm sure they won't all take it up. And I see Primark has already said they will not be accepting the money. But it will be a large bill. And there'll be many organizations who will be receiving this bonus, this £1,000 bonus, who actually don't really need it. So it's a very blunt instrument, to put it bluntly. But there will be recovery of some sorts in Q3. As we open up, as businesses open up, what they are producing does add to GDP. So there will be almost a natural recovery. And we're expecting, we're not expecting recovery this year, as I said, to be that strong. In other words, there'll still be a recession this year of 8%. But next year, we'll see a stronger recovery, subject to, of course, the vaccine and the absence of a second lockdown. Next year, we're expecting a recovery of over 5% in 2021. But you may realize, of course, if we fall 8% in 2020, a 5.6 in 2021 does not get us back to where we were before this crisis happened. And therefore, in my opinion, and the opinion of many business economists, and I'll show you some figures in a moment, we will not see the economy get back to where it was at the end of last year, perhaps until 2023. So the key point I want you to take from this is this. I don't think we can expect things to get back to normal any day soon. I think we've got a 2 to 3 year recovery, which will be difficult for many organizations and for many workers. And I wish it was going to be otherwise, but I just don't see it, because we're going into this, we went into this crisis with already a UK economy that was slowing down. Again, all the official data shows that. The UK was weakening in any case. This has pushed us down much faster. The lack of investment across the economy is a cause for concern and will therefore slow the recovery. Yes, I know the government's going to spend billions, but it takes time to build up capacity. It takes time to build factories. It takes time to build customs posts, for example, as you may have heard on the radio this morning. And this will not happen within 12 months. It's going to take much longer. I would not normally put up such a detailed slide, but I just thought I would give you this to highlight the key points. This was produced about 2 weeks ago by the EY Item Club. And for those of you who don't know it, the Item Club is the Independent Treasury Economic Modeling Club. It's hosted by EY. They pull together forecasts based on the Treasury's own economic model, but they're produced by the corporate sector for the corporate sector. So this is the business sector's view, not the political view, but the independent view by businesses in this country. And so let me just highlight some of the key points. First of all, you'll notice that the GDP, we grew only by 1.3, 1.4% in the 2 years before the crisis. They're forecasting a fall this year of 8%, recovery next year of 5.6%. But then, and that recovery next year, by the way, is not as strong as we would wish for. But then look at after 2021, the recovery then slows down back to a low rate of growth. And that's the business sector view. And actually, it's the view of most economists, including the government economists. We are not going to be booming after this crisis. And 1.6% growth is not particularly good news for this economy. We need to be growing like 2.5% to feel the impact of this. 1.6 is not good. Other points to look at here in terms of domestic demand, consumer spending, and fixed investment. Look at the right-hand side. This year, the prediction is that fixed investment, capital in machinery, etc., buildings, is going to fall by nearly 14%. Unprecedented fall, by the way. And there will be a recovery, but the growth of 3.9 next year and 6.7 the year after, and then 3.3, these are exceptionally low rates of growth for fixed investment. We need investment expenditure in this country to be something of the order of 8, 9, 10% growth rates every year to make up for the lack of investment over the last 10 or 20 or 30 years. So we're not investing enough in our infrastructure, in our skills, in our technology, right across the country. The government is aware of this. And of course, they are announcing investment plans, but the government can't do it all. They're going to have to create the conditions for the corporate sector to pump in much more money into our investment areas. And of course, net government borrowing, goodness me, the forecast is that this year the government will borrow almost 16% of GDP as a budget deficit. Again, unprecedented. You go back in history, this looks like wartime. And this, of course, feels like a wartime right now. And the government cannot sustain that level of borrowing, obviously. Borrowing 15% of GDP is not sustainable because it adds to the national debt. This mountain of debt that's building up, which we are going to pass on to our children and our grandchildren. It'll be with us for many, many, many decades to come. The problem is, how are they going to reduce the mountain of debt? Well, they're going to have to borrow less and less and less. And you'll see, of course, the forecast for next year, borrowing will still be very high at over 6%, we forecast, and then it will drop dramatically. Remember, the government was getting borrowing under control post-financial crises. Now it's back out of control, and they're going to have to run very, very hard to get it back under control again. The problem is, how do you get debt down? You either spend less or you tax more. I think that's a topic for another day, but I think it's going to be a bit of both, actually. The only other point to note on this slide is the average earnings. This year, we're forecasting a fall in average earnings for the first time in several years. Our earnings were recovering nicely, and they will recover again, but for this year and next year, it's going to be a tough time for workers in terms of their average earnings. Inflation, by the way, the CPI is not an issue. In fact, we're in a period of deflation, a lack of inflation. It will pick up again gradually, but clearly the Bank of England is not worried about it. Hence, they dropped interest rates to historic lows. So as I draw to a close, I want to leave time for questions. But I just want to highlight a number of risks and uncertainties facing the UK economy. And again, no big surprises. Perhaps the biggest risk is a second pandemic, a second wave of the coronavirus, and another lockdown. That would be a serious blow to the economy. I don't know if it's going to happen. I actually think it will happen, but I don't know for sure. If I look around the world, and particularly in the USA, they're heading that way already. Now, of course, the government is telling us that there will be local lockdowns in order to avoid a national lockdown. And let's hope that the tracing, the testing, and the tracking and so on is effective. We are told this morning on the radio that there have been a number of local lockdowns already, but they're quite small and therefore they haven't been announced. We've heard of Leicester, and we've now heard about this farm over in the Malvern Hills this morning. So perhaps it is effective. I just hope we don't have a national lockdown, but it is a risk, and no doubt that impacts consumer and business confidence. Of course, the scale of bankruptcies, we've already seen a number of bankruptcies, but there are more to come, I suspect, and more job losses, as I said earlier. And this, despite the £30 billion pumped in last week, and despite the previous hundreds of billions that have been pumped in. If companies are running out of cash, unless they're bailed out or nationalized, unless something dramatic happens, they are not going to survive. And that's really bad news for many, many businesses and for many workers out there. We wait and see what happens as the furlough is pulled back in the coming couple of months, and fingers crossed. But I would be wrong not to mention another risk, which was highlighted on all of the news programs this morning, and that is the risk of a hard Brexit. December 31st is approaching us very quickly, and I hope there's going to be a deal. Clearly, both sides are playing a game of poker, and it's a game of bluff. Who's going to call whose bluff first? But as each week passes, there's less and less time to negotiate that deal and to sign off on a deal. So the worst case scenario is that there will be a hard Brexit on December the 31st. To put that in context, what it means is that on January the 1st, any exports from the UK to the EU and vice versa will be subject to tariffs already specified under WTO rules. So to give you an example, just one example, cars produced in the UK, for example, a Nissan up in the northeast, Nissan, they export something like 90% of their cars are exported into Europe. Those cars will then be immediately, they will have a 10% approximately tax applied to them as they're exported into Europe. So the challenge then will be, can Nissan sell those cars in Europe at a price increase of 10% effectively? And vice versa, the cars coming from Germany into the UK will also be taxed as well. And many other products, of course. details to be discovered. Let's hope this hard Brexit doesn't happen. Because if it does, it's going to create tremendous uncertainty for business. There already is uncertainty. And the government announced this morning that they want to create certainty. They want business to start preparing for this situation. But it will have implications for investment spending. Of course, the government's going to spend more on customs post, but many businesses may spend less. And that will impact jobs, will impact pay for many people. And then, of course, what impact will non-tariff barriers have on trade? So tariffs represent the tax on trade, but then there are the non-tariff barriers, the regulations, the technical standards, the things that really can hinder trade over a long period of time, which have to be negotiated as well. And of course, there will be at some stage an impact on supply chains. I just hope that all of the ports, all of the channels, all of the flows between the UK and the EU, I hope it all goes smoothly. But it will only take 1 or 2 days of blockages on either side to bring supply chains to a halt. And that will have a tremendous impact on both sides of the channel. I don't expect sterling to get stronger any day soon, by the way. We've got a pandemic and we've got a Brexit situation. Two, I was going to say crises, I should say perhaps two challenges to deal with. Obviously, a weaker sterling is good for exports. And obviously, it means that import price will be higher. But we are now entering into what some people would call a perfect storm. And it's not a political statement. It's simply a reality. Businesses have to cope with adjusting to a new normal, adjusting to the COVID crises, adjusting to Brexit, adjusting to a changing balance of power in the world, what I called earlier the spheres of influence. It has never been a more challenging environment for business in this country and in many other countries, of course. On that note, therefore, let me just finish and say predictions today really are startling and volatile. So if anything that I've said proves to be wrong, I will not be surprised. It's the uncertainty I want to highlight. So much depends on social distancing, and until we get a vaccine and effective treatment, then I think that will continue to create uncertainty. We've seen a sharp fall already in GDP. There's going to be a tremendous fall in the Q2 period when the figures come out, but there will be a swift recovery. The question is, how strong will that be? And so much depends on the economic policies of the government being successful. I think the problem is, in trying to do so much, they've had to spread their resources across the economy. And the danger of that is that we may not actually see or feel the recovery as much as we would wish for. Government support is critical. I have to acknowledge that. The government had no choice but to spend our way in a recession. But there are the longer term implications, of course, for this economy in terms of debt, in terms of cost of borrowing, and perhaps in terms of longer term inflation. At the moment, the amount of money going in is not being spent on goods and services. A lot of the money is going into the bond market and into the property market, of course, and into stocks and shares. We're going to see asset price inflation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the economy is growing stronger. And so on that note, I'm going to stop and give an opportunity here for Q&A, and I hope you find this, not too depressing, that there is life after COVID-19. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you, Joe. Really great presentation there. We do have some questions coming through. So a good question to start off with. You mentioned lack of investment, lack of spending.
Yep.
But did the UK not? Is that not really alarming? Because the UK was kind of behind on investment and spending anyway, as part of this whole lack of productivity conundrum. So where does that leave us?
No, it is alarming, and it's been a long-term problem. Not just the last decade, but for 2 or 3 decades, we've been falling behind in terms of investment in capital and in people. And so this crisis has really knocked us back for 6. Clearly, the government is well aware of it, as I've said before, and they're trying to pump the money in. But the government sector isn't enough to do this. The government needs to do far, far, far more to encourage the corporate sector to invest in people and in technology and etc. and machinery. So I'm afraid as I said before, investment is the engine of growth, and that's going to result in a slower growth rate for this economy for many, many years to come. It would take a revolution in investment to reverse this, and I don't think it's going to happen. Sadly, it's my biggest concern of all, Atul.
Okay. So another really good question coming through, actually. So lots and lots of spending, unprecedented stimulus packages, the government has announced. Obvious question, how are we going to pay for it? And perhaps one of our tax colleagues had also covered it once you've answered there, really. So,
well, I said there's two ways of paying for it. There's actually three ways of paying for it. One is for the government to cut back on its own spending. Two, for the government to raise taxes. Third way to pay for it is economic growth, obviously. Now, I don't expect the economic growth to come through. And none of the forecasts are predicting that this economy will grow faster than it has been for the last 20 or 30 years. So the growth is not going to pay for this scale of borrowing. So it's got to be either higher taxes or lower spending or both. Now, if anybody can figure it out in any other way, congratulations. The money tree has been invented, but it's got to be paid for. And so the only question I think is which taxes are going to go up. I have no idea, but I suspect there will be raids on pots of money. Particularly, and this worries me, particularly those who've got more money than others in terms of savings and wealth, etc. in the future. I cannot see any increase in taxes for the lower paid. That clearly will not be on the cards. So I think higher tax rates for the higher paid and those with pots of money. You can figure that out yourselves.
Okay.
But there is no other source other than our cutback in government spending. But clearly that's going to be difficult as well.
Yeah. Lots of talk about VAT going up. It's certainly maybe expected that last week, but didn't happen. Alison, do you have a view on that, where VAT rates might go?
Well, we've got some really interesting statistics. If you think that last year the VAT take was 136 billion, which is 21% of the whole tax take. And when we had our VAT rate cut previously in 2008, the VAT take was 78 billion. So we're at 20% VAT now. It just seems that it's just too good an easy win. I mean, we saw the 5% for hospitality, but remember, hospitality is purely business to consumer. It's doubtful that that will get passed through to the consumer, understandably so. But that's just going to be £4 billion of cost to the country. But income tax is 31% of the tax take, and NIC is 22%.
And from what Joe was saying, obviously one of the problems that we've got as a country is that demand is weak, and whilst VAT might go up, surely we need to get to a point of greater stability. The economy is febrile, and everyone's predicting another budget come November, but I wonder whether the government's going to be brave enough to do anything with VAT now. What Joe was saying with regards to wealth, it seems to me that tax rises impact on behaviour, and one does wonder whether wealth and death and what have you becomes a taxing point which we can't control as humans, and therefore it becomes an easy win. So I do wonder whether capital tax rises are coming around the corner.
And there's two things certain in life, as you know, Nigel: taxes and death, and the two things together might be combined this time.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Thank you. Couple more questions, really. So, Joe, you touched on the pace that we've embraced technology. We've just moved forward in the last 3 months, way more than we perhaps ever thought possible. Perhaps would have taken years previously. Do you want to just talk us through the impact on jobs you think that might have? Because clearly, unemployment, lots of predictions around where we might end up with short-term and long-term unemployment. What are your thoughts on the race of technology on jobs?
If you go back through history, technology has always displaced labour short term because we adapt, we retrain, we reskill. And throughout history, we've had time to adapt. For example, the motor car, replaced the horse and cart. Well, people then went from horse and cart to driving cars. But it's the speed of adjustment that I was referring to. I think this COVID-19 crisis has accelerated trends that were already in place. The movement from face-to-face to online, from face-to-face shopping to retailing online, etc. As an example, it's simply accelerated that. Now, my question is have we got the skills across our society to adapt at this speed? And I'm not sure we have, because back to my earlier point, I think we've been very slack on investing in the skills base of our country for a long time. So I don't think, and I don't mean this in any humorous way, people working in shops are not going to be able to become online experts to deal with online retailing. It's a different skill set, and I mean that with all respect. And it's going to happen to so many other sectors. But dare I say, accounting. We've already moved. We're moving towards digital tax returns. And no offense, but how many accountants will we need? Lawyers, at the press of a button, case law, is pulled up in seconds by artificial intelligence. Well, how many more lawyers will we need? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there are so many examples of this. And by the way, I apply it to academics as well. Today, I could be a hologram. I may not be a real person. You don't know this. And maybe in 20 years' time, there'll be fewer academics. Certainly, some academics find it difficult to deal with this technology, online teaching. So again, it's the speed of adjustment that I'm worried about, most of all.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Joe. Final question. Very, very conscious of time, actually. So really good question coming through, actually. So this paradox of saving. The more we save, the less benefit it has on the economy. So do you think that that's going to kind of slow the uptake on the economy?
Well, whoever asked that question obviously is an economist, because the paradox of thrift is a phrase that was coined by John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s, where as consumer confidence falls, people save more. Now, at the moment, we don't save under the bed, thank goodness. We put it into the bank. The big question will be, will the Bank of England, will they move towards negative interest rates? Now, before anybody panics, let me explain negative interest rates. A number of countries have done this. Negative interest rates means that if you put your money into the bank will have surplus funds in its vault. It will not sit on those. Normally, a bank will then deposit those with the central bank. But if they do that under negative interest rates, they get a negative return, minus. They actually pay the Bank of England to hold their reserves. Now, that would then be passed through to the consumer, of course, and banks would then start levying. I don't think they go to negative deposit rates, by the way, but they would levy more charges on your bank accounts. And so, people will, the whole point of negative rates is to try and discourage people from saving more. They want them to borrow more. But the problem is this becomes a vicious circle. As the economy slows down, as rates fall, people think we're in trouble, I've got to save more. And there's the danger. Negative rates didn't do very much for Japan for the last 30 years, by the way. They were zero, actually, in Japan. And Japan has languished for the last 30 years. Could that happen to us? Yes, it could. Let's not, avoid this. Japan is still one of the richest countries in the world, but for the last 30 years, their growth rates have been incredibly low. We could be entering into that phase, by the way. Let's not forget that.
Brilliant.
Spend, please, everybody.
Well, that definitely seems to be the message. So very conscious of time now. So look, Joe, thank you very much for this morning. Really, really insightful presentation. We had over 200 on the webinar, so thank you to our clients, our contacts, our referrers. Thank you all for taking the time out of your schedules this Monday morning. Do please look out for our future webinars. We've got lots planned, so do please just click onto our MHA Academy on our website. So look, thank you so much, everybody, and we'll bring this morning to a close. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.